Hello and welcome to the 2023-2024 Program Monitoring Random Validation Phase 1 Process Training for the Title I Part C Migrant Education Program Training. In this session, we will provide you with an overview of the Title I Part C MEP program requirements. First of all, we want to share some things to keep in mind regarding this random validation process. Please note that documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and be available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. Another thing to note is that to ensure overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. In addition, keep in mind that the documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. If meeting documentation is to be provided for any requirement, please consider the following. The standard meeting documentation that an LEA should maintain locally includes meeting agendas, meeting minutes, notes, and sign-in sheets. Please note that documentation for virtual meetings is acceptable. Given the increased use of virtual meeting environments, participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and stakeholder names and roles would be acceptable substitutes for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need of a participant signature. We want to provide some additional guidance regarding the documentation requested as part of the MEP requirements. For this year's random validation for the Title I Part C program, we will only be accepting documentation from the current school year to ensure TEA is provided with adequate documentation to support the selected requirement. Priority for Service, PFS. Now let's talk specifically about the requirement for documentation for Priority for Service. According to ESEA, as amended by ESA, Section 1301(2) and 1304(d), the LEA gives service priority to migratory children who made a qualifying move within the previous one-year period and who were failing or most at risk of failing to meet the challenging state academic standards. Requirement 1.1 PFS reports. The required documentation for this program requirement is the Priority for Service or PFS reports. Copies of the monthly PFS reports must be submitted without student identifiable information. Additionally, reports showing no students found is also acceptable. Again, the documentation required for 1.1 are the copies of the monthly PFS reports without student identifiable information. Additionally, reports showing no students found are also acceptable. Some issues that may result in an improvement needed status could include the following. Audible documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation submitted doesn't reference the PFS criteria, or documentation submitted was not for the current school year. Requirement 1.2 District PFS Action Plan. The acceptable documentation to meet this requirement is a copy of the District PFS Action Plan for the current school year. Requirement 1.2. What are some of the issues that may result in an improvement needed status for this requirement? This could include audible documentation requested was not submitted, documentation submitted doesn't reference the PFS criteria, documentation submitted doesn't include detailed activities, documentation submitted was not for activities that took place in 2023-2024. Requirement 1.3 Supplemental Program Reports from TXNGS. In addition, the following is required only for LEAs with PFS students. The acceptable documentation includes the current year supplemental program count report from TXNGS, which lists supplemental services being provided to PFS students. Please remember to redact student identifiable information and highlight the unique student number. Requirement 1.3. So, what would be some of the issues that may result in an improvement needed status? This would include audible documentation requested was not submitted, documentation submitted was not for the current school year. Requirement 1.4. MEP services are provided to PFS students first. The following is required only for LEAs with PFS students, and this is the acceptable documentation. Relevant documentation that shows MEP services were provided to PFS students first. Requirement 1.4. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status for this requirement include the following. Audible documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation is not for the current school year. Thank you. These are the requirements to the Title I Part C Migrant Education Program as it relates to priority for service. We hope that you will find this information useful. Here is our contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions.